Digging for history, you know, it's like digging for treasure. Sometimes you dig away and you find a little coin, but if you keep going, you find a whole treasure chest. And that's what history's like. Sometimes you can pull out a little nugget and a fact that's so interesting, but if you dig a bit deeper, something much bigger comes. And that's why today we're in the Yorkshire village of Silkstone talking about the Cowp flood. Oh, Silkstone. Silkstone is the village that gives its name to the Silkstone coal seam, which, if I remember rightly, is the same coal seam as the Burnley Early mine, but I could be wrong on that. Wednesday, the 4th of July 1838 started off as a beautiful summer's day. It was just 6 days after the coronation of Queen Victoria, but a big storm was brewing. Now that storm travelled over Lancashire and then over Yorkshire to this village, and it caused a chain of events that would turn the course of English mining history for the next 150 years. Let's go and see what exactly happened that day. More than 100 men were at work at the Moorend Colliery that day. In fact, they just had a 4-day unpaid holiday for the coronation. The owner, Clark, had given them that holiday, and they celebrated with a fair around the village. But on that day they were working extra hard because obviously they'd done without money. The men were digging the coal, and that was taking away what we call in Lancashire drawers. They call hurriers and thrutches round here. And they were children, some as young as the age of 7, boys and girls. Now on that day, as the storm came across around about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the hailstones were so ferocious that it actually put the steam engine out, so they couldn't wind any coal anymore. And they couldn't wind the men and the boys up the shaft. So the banksmen shouted down the shaft for everybody to wait there while they rigged up something so they could haul them to the surface manually. But as the storm raged above, some of the children heard the thunder and they got frightened, and they thought that there'd been a fire damp explosion. So, in their panic, they made their way to a drift that was in this woods, Nab Woods, to see if they could get out quicker. Let's see if we can find that drift. Fortunately, the kids left the pit bottom, though they were told not to, because they were going to get their way out through a small drift that came up into these woods at Nab Woods, which was called the Husker Drift. Now I'm actually crouched in this trench, which was a brook, and 9 months out of 12, this brook, like today, would be totally dry. But that storm had swelled the brook. And this actually is where the mouth of the Husker Drift was. Now, as the children made their way up the drift, they had to get through some air doors that stopped the ventilation. Now, one party got through the air doors and they were making their way to daylight when a torrent of water came down the drift. Luckily, they managed to get into the side and avoid it. But some other children had just got through the air door, and the water came down and pushed them back to that closed door and drowned them. They couldn't do anything about it. They were child on top of child in the dark, in the panic, and it drowned 26 young children in this drift. And the cause of it was that storm and this brook. Now we're stood on the line of the Husker Drift. You can see where it's fallen in and there's a big crater behind me. We're stood perhaps 20 yards back from where the brook was. And if you listen, it's raining again. You can hear the rain on the canopy of trees, which gives quite a strange feeling to this place, where 26 young children met their death all those years ago. Now the events that day, on the 4th of July 1838, led to big changes in the British coal mining industry, because people were then alerted to the fact that women and young children were working down the mines, as if they didn't know beforehand. But with a young queen on the throne, and things were changing a little bit. So a commission was set up, and Anthony Ashley Cooper, the 7th Earl of Shaftsbury, was set up to lead that inquiry into the mining industry and the women and children working underground. And he brought out a report in 1842 that led to the banning of women working underground for the next 150 years, and also the age of children was raised to 10. Well, let's tie it in with Rochdale, shall we? Because 26 children died here, but a lot of people don't know that in that very same storm, 3 children were killed in a pit at Norden near Rochdale that day. They were John Shepherd, Abraham Grinwood and Samuel Dearden, and they were aged between 10 and 11 years old. You won't find them in the history books, and sadly there isn't even a brass plate to remember them in Rochdale. But hopefully we can change that. So let's now look into what happened back in Lancashire that day. Welcome to the west of the Pennines, Lancashire. To be more precise, we're at Helm Shore in the Rosendale Valley. And as the song goes, like the legend of Jerusalem with its dark satanic mills. Now, while we were over in Silkstone, the coal owners were the Clarks. For the Lancashire end of the story, we're not concentrated on coal owners because they weren't as such. They were cotton and woolen manufacturers. And the Turner family particularly are at the head of our story. The Turners were big cotton and woolen manufacturers from Blackburn. Very, very rich, very, very successful. And they bought land here in Helm Shore and built Hire Mill in about 1792. And it was a partnership of brothers. But one by one, different brothers fell out. And then basically at the end, what we're going to discuss is William and Ralph Turner. But the family is really, really interesting in that the nephew of William Turner was also called William, and he became Blackburn's first MP. And he was incredibly successful, incredibly rich. He was a millionaire himself at that time in the 1830s. And he had a very interesting life. His life story was a bit like what Catherine Cookson could write, because his daughter, well, she fell to a cad and a bounder who got her to elope with him for a fortune. Well, that's another story. Let's concentrate on the Turners and the mills. Now in 1823, William and Ralph Turner, they constructed another mill nearby, Hollingbank Mill, which came to be known as Middle Mill. And they were early pioneers of steam engines. They powered the mills not only by water, but by steam. And Hollingbank had a 70 horsepower beam engine working there. And we certainly know the coal to power that in 1828 came from Bacup. It came from Oak and Clough, Oil and Old Eye collieries. And the Turners were paying one shilling, 1 penny per load. And every £100 they spent, they got a £5 discount. Now Holling Mill itself, very historic as well, and in 1826 it was the first mill to be attacked by the what were known as the Lancashire Loom breaking riots. Basically there were people, they were starving. It was a very difficult time. The corn laws at that time had made food so expensive, people were literally starving to death at home. So to call them riots, it's a bit explosive language really. They were desperate people. But anyway, Hollingbank had its looms destroyed, and it didn't please Mr. Turner very much, and it ended up after 2 or 3 days of rioting in basically what's known as the Chatterton Massacre, which a bit like Peterloo really, a mini Peterloo, but people were shot by a band of dragoons at Chatterton on your way to Ramsbottom. So the Turners really were large mill magnates, cotton magnates. They made great wealth out of that, and at some point in the early 1830s they turned their attention to a new mill at Blackpits, and that's where our story now takes us. The more discerning might recognise this place, this mill, as a scene of one of Sharp's Rifles episodes where there's trouble at mill and Sharpie and Pat come to sort the job out. So here we are at Blackpits, and the coal banks in the background. Now there have been mills here for a long, long time. In 1810 there was 2 water-powered mills here that were up for sale in 1810 and then 1816. Both mills contained 30-foot water wheels. But then the Turner brothers came here around about 1832, I think, thereabouts, and they built Blackpits Mill. Now there was at least 4 Turners and a guy called George Potter as well. And we know that they built the mill about that time because a year later in 1833 somebody tried to burn it down. There was a newspaper report of somebody walking down the road, smashing a window and throwing 2 bunches of matches through. Now luckily one bunch of matches, the fire went out straight away, but the other bunch, well, they landed on a drying frame and it set fire to some cotton. But as luck would have it, the cotton fell into a deep can that hardly had any cotton in it, and the fire went out. But the Turners were so distressed that they offered up £100 to find out who'd done it, and they never did find out who'd done it. So the storm raged on the 4th of July through most of Lancashire, although strangely enough, 2 miles away in Haywood, they hardly even had a drop. But what they did have was a whirlwind, and the colliers working at Hopwood Hall Colliery heard a noise that they thought was like a steam engine bursting. Now one of the best descriptions we have is from the Blackburn Standard, And in Blackburn itself, it started to rain about 11 o'clock in the morning, and an intense darkness fell upon the whole town, as the man called it an ebb and pall of night. He said it was like an Egyptian darkness, and those that were working inside, they had to give over working, they couldn't see. Now in Rochdale it started raining about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but by 2:30 the streets were like rivers, and the rain had turned to hail. Sometimes it was going on for 3 or 4 inches in diameter, just ice falling from the sky. It was smashing all the skylights on the mills, all the greenhouses, everything. So you can imagine the intense damage that was done. However, back up on the moors, 2 miles away on what we now call Hailstorm Hill, that storm was raging, and that water up there was making its way in torrents down towards Blackpits, down to Norden Brook. And as you look at Norden Brook today, it's nice and peaceful, but back then on the 4th of July, as the men and the women and the boys and girls worked in the mill, there was a wall of water heading towards them, and it was said that within 5 minutes the mill went from working full to chaos and destruction. By 1836, the partnership of the Turner brothers was dissolved, and there was just 2 of them left, William and Ralph, running the mill. Now on the 4th of July, Norden Brook, that's beside us, was a raging torrent. We couldn't have stood up where we are today, and we were more or less walking along the back wall of the mill where the weaving shed was. The weaving shed was a massive building, it was over 250 feet long, and a wall of water came down Norden Brook. Not just water, there was rubble, there was rocks, there was trees, there was everything that torrent had tore up in front of it that was heading towards Blackpits Mill. Now can you imagine the fear, the surprise amongst people as the back wall of the mill started to get battered and then gave way, the panic as people exited the mill running as fast as they could. The water just passed through the mill as though it wasn't there, through both walls. It destroyed nearly 700 looms, and when it got to the other wall there was a gas accumulator at the other side where they made the gas for the gas lights, and it pushed that away, it destroyed that also. But another thing that was the other side of the wall was the colliery, and that's where 3 men were still left underground. There was 1 man on the pit top, and underground was probably the banksman and 2 young children who were drawing the coal. What was going to happen to them? Now there are lots of similarities between the Moorend colliery and the old Clapgate here, in that there was just a shaft and a drift. The shaft here was only 30 feet deep, but we don't know anything at all, hardly, about the pit. Just that there was a 30-foot shaft for bringing the coal up. We don't know any winding arrangements, and there was a drift for access. So had the storm already been causing problems at the pit that was more or less at ground level where we are now? But certainly when the water hit the mill, burst through the mill, there certainly would have been problems. It appears from the very scant newspaper reportings, and that's the thing, that the reports are very, very scant, that the water just went down the shaft. Not just the water, but all the debris from the mill, everything that had been washed down the hill. So water, mud, wood, things out of the mill was cascading down the shaft. So obviously nobody was getting up the shaft. Now the banksman sent a young lad to go to the drift near Moss Row, to go underground to try and get the 3 people out the pit. Now 1 was a man, and I think he possibly was the onsetter working at the bottom of the shaft. Now we don't know which young lad they sent underground, but we know finally there was 3. There was John Shepherd, Abraham Grinrod, and young Samuel Dearden, Samuel was the youngest actually, he was only 9 years old. Now they couldn't get out, the water would have overwhelmed them. The main road in the mine descended at an angle of 1 in 9, so water was just cascading down the main road. It could have been knocking timber out as it went, and even if they could try and get out, just like at Husker, that cascading water would have knocked them onto the ground, it would have bowled them over, they'd have lost the lights, they'd have been in the dark. Now at first it was hoped that the 3 lads had got to some high ground to safety, but obviously that wasn't the case. But it's so confusing. I know a lot was going on at the time with the different mills being demolished and everything that was going on around here at the time, but there's very little talked about what went on at the colliery. And can you imagine the anguish that was on the surface? 3 grieving mothers, the rest of the families, the anxiety. What sort of a rescue attempt must it have been? It wasn't a case just of pumping water. They had to more or less dig all of that detritus out of the pit as well. Now the accident occurred on Wednesday afternoon. We don't know at what time the flood abated and they started rescue operations, but they didn't reach the 3 lads until the Sunday morning. And you can imagine that that rescue would have gone on day and night till they'd have got to find them. And when they did find them, how heart-wrenching. Can you imagine the suffering that went on? The fear of those 3 lads being cooped up in that little mine and the water slowly rising. It must have been terrible. Why isn't there more written about it? Why did it not make the papers more? And why are they not remembered? Now it's impossible to tell exactly where the shaft really was today, although we think we're more or less in the exact position, and it was just off to the side of this little road. Well, we found a plan in the archives that shows the location, but as you can see, it's all been built on. But there was also a drift where the rescue operations more than likely took place, and that was in the front of Moss Cottage. So what we're going to do now is see if we can find any remains of the drift. In the mornings this lane would have rang to the sound of weavers' clogs. Turners have built 40 cottages up here, Moss Row, and every morning this would be alive with the people going to work. And the drift was just in front of the cottages, and to be honest, I don't think we're going to really find anything today, but it'd be nice just to have a look and see the basic area of where it was. Well, as you can see, we can't get down to where the drift was. It's where the allotments are. Well, this is where Moss Row was. So it's sad that we can't get access to it. Well, it's a bit of a drizzly start on this September morning, but I'm excited today because we're off down to Rochdale and we're going to go to the local studies library and we're going to be having a look through the Scotland survey books from 1834. Now, the survey books of Scotland, basically they showed who owned what, who was liable for what taxes, or poor law relief. Today we call it business rates. Well, with a bit of luck, we're going to find who was running the pit by the side of the mill. And as time's gone on, it's looked increasingly more unlikely that it was actually the Turner brothers. Now, I've had emails back from the records library at Rochdale. They've been very helpful. But sadly, I've sent emails off to Higher Mill, Helmshore Textile Museum, and they've never bothered getting back to me, which is rather sad. Either that or they've changed their email address on the website. Another man that's very kindly replied to me is a man by the name of Donald Fletcher, and he's associated with St Chad's Church in Rochdale, where the lads were buried. So we're going to go also to St Chad's to see if we can find the gravestone of the 3 boys. So it's lovely that these people have helped us, and as I say, it's an exciting day. We're going to come to a conclusion of certain things. It's around about 6:30. And if we rewound back to the 4th of July, back in 1838, well, the 3 lads, they'd probably be down the pit at this time, just making their way in with the first run of empties, tired, muscles and joints aching, trying to loosen up, and little did they know what to expect for the rest of the day. Well, here we are in Rochdale. We've got John Bright's statue in the park behind me, and we've got the records office just over the road. So let's hoping this turns out good. It's quite impressive in here as well. Map of Rochdale. Loom, that's what they were smashing up in 1826, sorry. Aha! Here we've got a tub. there's a Shaftsbury up. I know some of these photos are like that. That's a collier from Norden. I know that. I don't know who the old guy is. Soon find out. John Greenwood, living at Sheffield in 1834. So that's the first victory of the day. John Greenwood, the collier, the father of one of our boys. So here we are, Black Pits, 1834. Mill owned, Turner. Occupier's name, it just says in hand. Look down to the particulars of the mill, different parts of it on this side, valuations. And if we look down, there we see Colliery, owned by William Turner, although where it says occupants it just says in hand, but it says in hand for everything, and it's given an annual valuation of £16, 13 shillings and 4pence. So there we are in black and white, valuation also. And according to that, it looks as though it is owned, certainly, by the Turners. So as we can see, the mill and the colliery are part of the same complex. They're absolutely inseparable. So whoever owned the mill owned the colliery. And as we can see from this sketch of the area, that proves the case. So we have to ask the question, did the mill owner get the press to play down his involvement? And I think we have a valuable argument in that. We've got the baptism records of Abraham Greenrod, and here we've got Samuel Dearden's baptism, but sadly we can't find anything to do with John Shepherd. Now we have managed to uncover the burial records, all three lads in the same day. Now if you notice, their names and their ages are slightly different at times. So we will take the burial records as being the right ones. That's been a fruitful day. I'm really chuffed that not only have we found the colliery actually in the Scotland survey book, but we found Abraham Greenrod's father, John Greenrod, and where he lived in Sheffield. So what I said this morning, that we sort of doubted that the Turners actually owned the pit, according to the survey records there in 1834, it's down that they owned it. If later on they leased it out, we don't know, but they certainly owned the pit in 1834. So here we are. And another thing, while I was actually just killing time at the end of the day, I picked up a book written by a local historian to Rochdale, Chris Aspin, and there was an interesting bit about the Turners in there. Back in those days in the 1840s, obviously you couldn't just pick and choose where you worked. You couldn't just up and away. You usually got fined if you had to give so many weeks notice before you left, or they came and carted you off. Well, actually, the people that worked for Turners, they had to sign 7-year contracts in his Helmshore mills. And there's reports in the book there of a couple of workers being sent to jail. One got sent there first for 3 months, and then later on he got another 3 months. And then later on, one of the spinners, well, he got arrested for leaving, and he actually got 6 months in jail. And the irony of it was, well, this is how unfair it was, there's no irony. The magistrate who sentenced him was none other than Turner himself, the magistrate. So that's the situation these people worked under, and that's the situation they were working under at the pit as well. But come on, we're going to go now to the churchyard where the 3 lads were buried. Well, the 3 lads were laid to rest on the 11th of July, on the same day, in St Chad's churchyard in Rochdale, and they've been burying people here since the 12th century. You look behind me, got me out of puff a bit, these steps coming up. This is the route that people took coming out the town centre. So the 3 lads were buried on the same day, not necessarily together. And a very kind man and his wife by the name of Donald Fletcher, who's one of the wardens here, I think, was trying to find the grave for me and look into some literature, but sadly there's nothing to be seen, I'm afraid. As I'll show you, I will become apparent in a second. Well, in a cruel irony, Like the rest of the story really, in the graveyard in Rochdale there's no big obelisk like there is in Silkstone with the names of the three lads written on it. Sadly, it's like the rest of the story. You can't find the pit shaft, it's slabbed over, concreted over, and there's no gravestones for us to see up here neither. I mean, they've been burying people since the 13th century, and they opened up a new graveyard here apparently 1815 thereabouts was the first new person to be buried here. And since then, in the 1970s I believe, it got landscaped. So there's no trace. The paving stones, they look like normal paving slabs, but actually each one is a gravestone. It's just laid down flat, and all the inscriptions are still on there. So we could do a reenactment, if you like, from The Good, Bad and the Ugly, that incredible film scene there where you've got Clint Eastwood and Tuco running around the graveyard with that incredible music score going on, looking for the unknown grave next to Art Stanton. But that's not going to happen. So it's rather sad that there isn't a final place we can look for the three lads, but there you go. Well, I couldn't think of a better place to end this particular video. There's no memorial here like there is in Silkstone, but I think where we are now is the biggest memorial there is to Lancashire industry, both in Rochdale and Rosendale. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the two ladies in Touchstone's library. I should have done that earlier really. So we've established then that it obviously looks like William Turner owned the pit. He certainly owned the mill, and why wouldn't you want to build a mill there? It was a dream, wasn't it? You had a fast flowing river, and then you'd coal just 30 feet under the surface, and steam engine. He had his own gas producer. He had it made really, didn't he? There's quite a few times I've tried to put myself in the position of those three lads and how they must have felt at the time. I mean, I have worked in that industry myself for quite a while, 20 odd years, and I was a drawer. And as a 17-year-old drawer, your mind's on basically getting home, seeing your girlfriend, getting a few pints and going and seeing a band. But how do you put yourself in the mind of a 9-year-old back in 1838? Were they looking forward to getting a bit of playing in the evening? Did they have any play left in them after a day at the pit as a 9-year-old? I don't know. I wonder if they had any indications that there was a storm brewing as well. Perhaps the empties were coming in wet, full of water. Whatever indication they had, it must have been terrifying for them. As I said, there was just the two lads underground and a man, the man possibly being the onsetter at the bottom of the shaft. And it seemed to be quite a common practice in Lancashire at the time, even up to the 1870s, where the colliers they'd hew the coal, and then they would leave the coal on the floor for the drawers to fill and to take to the pit bottom or to the haulage. And the colliers would go home and just leave the lads underground. So you got a pit full of sort of 9, 10, 11-year-olds, 6, 7-year-olds maybe. And from later reports we know that those young lads could have been actually working underground since they were 5 years old. Whatever the situation was, young Abraham and Samuel were terrified, and they found them clutched in each other's arms. Did John die alone somewhere, or was he in the neighbourhood with them? All the same, it must have been a terrible, frightening way to go. And although they never met the children from Silkstone, they didn't even know each other existed. Both sets shared the same fate on the same day. Water, darkness and fear. And I know the Penistone group, they have an archive there back at the church, and they do a lot of work educating school children and keeping alive the memory of the Husker disaster. And it would be nice if when they are teaching and talking about it, that they could also remember the three lads from Norden, because they had a common purpose and a common death. So the outcome was the big inquiry by Lord Ashley and the big report that went through all the coal fields. Rochdale's mentioned in it. They interviewed Mr. Roscoe, Thomas Roscoe. People were horrified, naturally. There was a big outcry, and sometimes I think some of the outcry was also not just the fact that women and children were working underground, because women and children worked anyway. Sometimes it was the conditions that they were found working in a semi-naked condition. So there was two sides to Victorian morality. But nevertheless, the Act was passed in 1842 and came law in January of 1843. Was it successful? To an extent, yes. There were still women and young children found working underground in quiet, out of the way places. That carried on. But really, all the problem did, when you think about it, it took the children and the girls out the pits and it put them in the mills. The mills were just as dangerous as the mines were, perhaps at times even more so. And as an ex-pitman myself, I think I'd perhaps have rather taken my chances underground than in one of the cotton mills. Well, as you can see behind me, that's Hailstorm Hill. That's where the flood waters, well, the surge waters came from. All the water running down the Norden Valley to meet the already flooded streets down below. Now, that's basically the end of our story, but we want to finish with a postscript. In the 1840 Act, in the report of the 1842 Act, there was actually a sketch done of a collier working in the pit in Rochdale. He worked for Mr. Roscoe, and it's great to see that sketch. I know it's not a photograph, but it's the nearest you're going to get. 1841, Rochdale. And the collier's got a big chunk missing from his shoulder, and basically he got it kicked out of him in a clog fight. So there were brutal times as well. And to add to the tale of the brutal times, we'll just finish with this. This story ended up in the national press, and it also found its way into the preliminary report, Ashley's report. And it was of a young lad by the name of Edmund Kershaw, who lived in Castleton, Rochdale. And he was apprenticed to a collier by the name of Robert Brearley, who lived at Bagslate. And they worked together in a pit in the vicinity of Ruley Moor. Now, it doesn't tell us which pit, sadly. And one day, Edmund was delivered back home to his mother on a cart, and he was basically nearly dead. And he was 12 years old, so the Act wouldn't have saved him. He would have still been in the pit even after the Act was passed. Now, when he was examined, he didn't need much examining. There wasn't a hair left on his head, and his head was full of old scars and wounds. On his body, there were at least 26 wounds. His backside and his loins were beaten to a jelly, and his arm, he'd been hit by a metal rail and his arm had been broken, and he'd had to work like that with a broken arm for a couple of days. And Brearley hadn't really fed him, just barely enough to keep him alive. And it came to the point where poor Edmund couldn't do anything else. He basically collapsed. So he was put on a cart and sent back to his mother. Now, not only that is that terrible as far as Brearley is concerned, you know, man's a disgrace, but where does that also put the colliery owners? They knew these things were going on. Now, Brearley was arrested. The police went to Bagslate to arrest him, but he got wind that they were coming, and he ran off to his dad's house, his father's house, on Woodhouse Lane, but they caught up with him there. And when he was tried, the courtroom was packed, but young Edmund, he couldn't even stand up, so they had to strap him to a cot and just prop him up. And obviously Brearley was found guilty, but you know, he was fined £5. And to add insult to injury, he strolled in later that night and paid the £5. Such was the price of a young lad's life. Now, we may think these things happened back in the 1830s and the 1840s, deep underground where nobody could see, out of sight, out of mind, and that's how many people will excuse themselves for turning a blind eye to these things happening. But you know, we haven't really come very far. Perhaps if you look at the label in your clothing, anything that you find in your wardrobe, see where it came from, where it was made, who made it. Perhaps if you've got an electric car, ask yourself, where did the precious metals for the battery come from? Who produced them? And when you ask these questions and look into it, you find that we haven't come very far from the 1830s and 1840s. These things still go on, but again we have the excuse that it's far away where we can't see it. But nothing has changed.